Dear Mr. Garvey, for referring
Continue.
For referring me to your prepared research material. If you would be so kind, Fitz and I will review it immediately.
The movie opens with Lee leaving a mental hospital on the day of her sister's wedding as she anxiously waits for her mother to pick her up. The doctor who cared for her says his goodbyes when her mother, Joan, arrives. Joan tries to greet Lee cheerfully, but Lee simply stares back at her without saying a word. At the wedding, Lee watches her sister kiss her new husband and politely applauds. Peter approaches her and asks if she's happy to be home. At first, Lee nods, but when Peter presses further, she quietly admits that she doesn't know. During the reception, Lee's father, Bert, greets her while drinking a beer. Lee mentions that she thought he had quit drinking, but Bert ignores her and simply hands the bottle to Peter. Clearly intoxicated, Bert continues drinking throughout the evening. Lee eventually retreats to her room, where she goes through her belongings from before her hospitalization. She picks up a doll and considers cutting herself on the thigh. However, when she notices her sister and her husband leaving in a luxury car, she stops. Later that night, while boiling water in the kitchen, Lee accidentally overhears her parents arguing about several things, including birds and her father's job troubles. She walks over to see what's happening and is shocked when Bert pushes Joan to the ground before storming out of the house. Afterward, Lee returns to the kitchen, carries the kettle of hot water to her room, and presses it against her thigh, burning herself. She smiles, seemingly finding comfort in the pain. The following day, Lee attends a typing class where she demonstrates her impressive typing skills. Her mother comes to pick her up on the way home. During the ride, Lee recalls a past incident involving knives. When Joan carefully hid some knives upon her arrival, Lee finds her mother locking the knives on a shelf, explaining that it's a precaution. Lee just stares at her and then goes outside to throw out the trash in the trash can. Lee discovers her old needle and thread bag and decides to pick it up as she holds the bag. She also finds a newspaper page with job advertisements and decides to take that as well. Back in her room, she reviews some job listings while practicing a few sentences she could use during an interview. The next day, Lee went to an address she found in the newspaper. Upon entering the office, she was surprised to discover a woman who had left the office in tears, leaving everything in disarray. Despite the chaos, Lee pressed on and eventually found Mr. Gray in the office. He was looking at a photo of a blonde woman before Lee's arrival. After introducing herself, Gray asked Lee some unusual questions, like whether she was pregnant and if she lived in an apartment. Lee nervously answered these questions as Mr. Gray began inquiring about Lee's qualifications and awards. He pressed a button revealing a beautiful garden that left Lee in awe. She handed her typing results to Mr. Gray, who was busy dialing his phone. He asked Lee for a cup of coffee and she obliged, going to the food pantry to prepare it. During this process, she accidentally spilled water on herself while trying to refill the water cooler. When she returned to Mr. Gray's office, he commented on the potential monotony of the job and noted Lee's nervousness. He suggested she relax, but Lee simply smiled, admitting she didn't know how. Just as the phone rang, Mr. Gray told her to ignore it and advised her to use less sugar in the coffee next time. After this interaction, Lee walked to Joan's car and excitedly informed her mother that she had secured the job. When they returned home, Lee decided to relax in the bathtub while practicing her lines for work. The following morning marked Lee's first day in Mr. Gray's office. She took on various tasks, running errands for him, organizing his clerical work. Lee would often gaze at Mr. Gray's office, observing him as he tended to the garden's flowers. Eventually, she would enter his room, leaving a few donuts behind. Gray mentioned that he had discarded some notes, and Lee volunteered to search for them in the trash. Before Lee left, the two of them locked eyes and exchanged a long, silent gaze as she delved into the trash. Mr. Gray watched her curiously from the window. When Lee finally found the missing file, she proudly returned to the office, only for Mr. Gray to dismiss her efforts, explaining that he had already found another copy. Instead, he simply assigned her more work. Despite her best efforts, Lee struggled to set a mousetrap with a chair. Gray began checking her work and their eyes locked once more, holding each other's gaze until the phone rang at the front desk. Later, Lee tended to the wound that Mr. Gray had seen earlier, feeling somewhat embarrassed. She packed her bags and Mr. Gray watched her by the door before leaving after work. Lee and Joan discussed Lee's day, and Joan mentioned that Peter had called her, which brought a smile to Lee's face. Later, Lee met Peter at a nearby laundromat, and as they engaged in a conversation about relationships, Lee took a big sip of her drink while discussing how much they had changed since high school. Mr. Gray suddenly walked into the laundromat. He noticed Lee and Peter discussing underwear before they kissed. Gray quickly averted his gaze and returned to his car. The next day at work, a frustrated Mr. Gray rushed up to Lee, handing her a letter with 3 typographical errors. Lee awkwardly apologized, but Gray continued to berate her, ordering her to retype and correct it throughout the day. Lee worked diligently to correct her mistakes repeatedly, redoing the letter, which left her feeling frustrated. By the end of the day, Lee approached Mr. Gray's room to submit another letter. Initially, he ignored her, instructing her to make a bill for a woman outside. However, he suddenly noticed a teardrop on Lee's skirt and began to berate her, criticizing her attire, scolding her for excessive sniffing and commenting on her restlessness. Lee then went to the food pantry where she practiced how to thank Mr. Gray for his advice as she aspired to become his best secretary. But just as she was about to return to his office, she suddenly heard him scream and reprimanded someone else's typing work. Anxiously, she returned to the front desk, fiddling with her hair. Later, after leaving the office, Lee went to Peter's house to tour with Peter's parents. The following day, Mr. Gray called Lee into his office, instructing her to pick up the phone. Lee was confused because there was no ringing, but Mr. Gray began making ring noises, asking her to answer the phone. He then pointed out that she should have a louder voice and sound more confident when she spoke. They continued their conversation, and Lee admitted she was dating Peter, but laughed off the question of whether they had slept together. They discussed shyness and how it shouldn't hinder them from opening up to each other. Gray then inquired about Lee's wound and the sewing tool she always had, which surprised Lee. She simply told him she was shy, and they both laughed before Mr. Gray offered her some hot chocolate. As Lee sipped her hot chocolate, Mr. Gray asked her why she would hurt herself. When Lee admitted she didn't know, he questioned whether it was because she needed tangible proof of inner pain to remind herself of her existence, or if it provided her comfort to witness the healing process. Lee, still surprised, found herself agreeing with his perspective. Gray reassured her that she would never hurt herself again. Lee nervously nodded in agreement. He then instructed her to leave work early, take a walk home, and breathe the fresh air because she was an adult now. Before Lee left, Gray took a photo of her, capturing her relaxed and smiling expression as she left work that day. She told her mother that she would start taking walks from now on. Lee talked to herself, realizing she had never walked alone before, and she began to feel something for Mr. Gray. The following day at work, Mr. Gray berated Lee for her spelling mistakes, making her sniffle. Hearing her distress, Mr. Gray asked me to come to his office, where he instructed her to read a letter on his desk while bending over. When Lee admitted she didn't understand Mr. Stand, Gray asserted there was nothing to understand and repeated his instruction as she began to read. Mr. Gray suddenly smacked her on the bottom, startling her and causing her to stop. He ordered her to continue and spanked her while she finished the rest of the letter. Lee seemed to enjoy what Mr. Gray was doing until he suddenly stopped, leaned in close, and put his arm around her. Both were panting, and Lee intertwined her little finger with Mr. Gray's. However, Gray told her to straighten up before returning to work. Still excited by her recent experiences, Lee returned to her desk and handed the letter to Mr. Gray. Later, he came over while she was scanning some files and complimented her on her excellent work, making Lee smile. When she got home, Lee told her mother that she could now remove the lock from the cabinet. The following morning, Lee threw her old belongings into the river, symbolically letting go of her past before heading to Mr. Gray's office. Throughout the day, Ms. Gray assigned her various tasks, and Lee eagerly obeyed all of his commands. Later that evening, as Lee prepared for bed, she couldn't help thinking about her interactions with Mr. Gray. She was momentarily distracted when she noticed a picture of Peter, but she quickly set it aside and refocused her thoughts on Mr. Gray. The next day at work, Lee noticed a mistake in the letter she was writing, but deliberately chose not to correct it, hoping Mr. Gray would notice it himself. When she approached him to submit the letter, however, he ignored both her and her attempts to engage him. Upset by his cold behavior, Lee returned to her desk and corrected the mistake before heading home. Before leaving, Lee asked Mr. Gray if there was anything else he needed her to do. He simply told her she had done well for the day, leaving Lee disappointed as she went home. The next morning, while out with Joan and some friends, they received a call informing them that Bert had been hospitalized. Joan rushed to her husband's bedside in tears, while Lee went to Mr. Gray's house. Upon arriving, Mr. Gray seemed surprised to see her. Lee tried to express her feelings, but lost her nerve and instead made an excuse, saying she had come to remind him about a letter needed for the following day. Mr. Gray thanked her for the reminder but rejected her unspoken advances. Over the following days, Mr. Gray continued to distance himself from Lee at work. He removed her from the office, ended their previous interactions, and even threw away the red marker he used to correct her typing mistakes. Desperate to win him back, Lee tried everything she could to regain his attention. Later, while alone in the bathroom, Lee attempted to recreate the feeling she had experienced with Mr. Gray, but she couldn't recapture the same sensation. The next morning, Lee found a bug in the yard and placed it inside one of Mr. Gray's letters. When Mr. Gray discovered it, he went to the restroom to clean himself while Lee watched him with eager anticipation. Later that day, Lee was in bed with Peter, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Mr. Gray's letters. Although she allowed Peter to be intimate with her, she still seemed unsatisfied. The following day, Mr. Gray found another letter containing the bug and circled it with a red marker, pointing out her mistake. When Lee entered his office, she heard someone ringing the doorbell, but Mr. Gray instructed her to ignore it. He then ordered her to undress and bend over. Lee was surprised but reluctantly complied, allowing Mr. Gray to touch her intimately. When he was finished, she returned to her desk, feeling both confused and seemingly satisfied by the encounter. Later, at a nearby restaurant, Lee listened to a tape discussing submissive and dominant relationships. Meanwhile, Mr. Gray stood outside burning photographs of her, silently watching them melt away. The next day, Gray called Lee into his office and asked her the same questions he had asked during her job interview. Lee corroborated and answered each one honestly. However, Mr. Gray told her that although he liked her, she could no longer work for him because of her behavior. At first, Lee thought he was playing another game, but she realized he was serious when he handed her a letter along with her severance pay. She left the office in tears and remembered the woman she had seen on the day of her interview. Over the following days, Lee pretended to go to Miss Gray's office, instead watching it from across the street. She noticed the new secretary he had hired. Lee also tried exploring other relationships to see if they could fulfill the desire she had discovered, but eventually gave up and focused on helping her father instead. Later, Peter proposed to her, and she accepted, not because she truly wanted to marry him, but because she felt she had no other choice. As she tried on a wedding dress, Lee suddenly removed the veil and stared at herself in the mirror. She then rushed away, leaving the engagement ring on the table, and ran to Mr. Gray's office. There, she confessed her love for him, but Mr. Gray denied it, insisting that everything had already been settled when he gave her the severance pay. He ordered her to place her palm on his desk and keep it there until he returned. Lee continued waiting in Mr. Gray's office while he watched her from outside. Gray called Peter and informed him that Lee was in his office. He then called the office himself and was surprised to find Lee trying to answer the phone with her mouth, quietly murmuring to herself. Gray finally admitted that he also had feelings for Lee. Peter soon arrived at the office, clearly disappointed. Lee told him to leave, saying that he was intruding. Confused, Peter asked what had happened, but Lee refused to remove her hand from the desk. When Peter tried to move it, she screamed in anger, slapped him, and accidentally hurt him before placing her hand back on the desk. She insisted that she did not want him and demanded that he leave. The next morning, despite visitors offering words of encouragement and advice, Lee remained in the office. Exhausted from the ordeal, she ignored everyone's support and continued to wait. Meanwhile, life outside the office carried on, while Mr. Gray stayed at home, unable to stop thinking about Lee. By the third day of Lee's stay in the office, local news reporters had gathered outside, drawing public attention to the unusual situation. Later that night, Gray finally returned. He embraced Lee and gave her some coffee before taking her out of the office and driving her home. Relieved, he carefully carried her outside, gently laid her down on the grass, and prepared a warm bath for her. He washed her carefully, dried her with a towel, and afterward laid her back on the grass, quietly looking at her and examining each of her scars. Lee told him that it was the first time she had ever truly felt beautiful. As time passed, Lee and Mr. Gray opened up to each other like never before. Their unusual relationship gradually grew into one built on trust, acceptance, and genuine love. They eventually got married and celebrated their new beginning with a peaceful honeymoon in the mountains, finally finding the happiness they had both been searching for. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next recap.